So intangible assets is our next big section of non-current assets. They lack physical substance, similar to financial instruments and receivables, but they are assets that are going to be used in our operations. And one of the core things that affect their valuation is that there's usually a high degree of uncertainty with regard to the likely future benefits of owning these assets. They're typically associated with rights, and we'll look at that below. There's two different routes to obtain an intangible asset. We could purchase them from an external source, like maybe another company. Maybe we merge and acquire an entire company. Then we do sort out what the purchase price of, even if we buy an entire company, some of that money is used to acquire their intangibles. We'll even kind of figure out, well, what value should we record those intangibles at? But this is only when we're acting exterior. So in purchase price and legal fees, everything that we saw with PP&E applies when we're purchasing from an external source. This typically will produce high book values for intangibles. Now, this is very different than internally creating or developing them. This is when we're starting to work with R&D and developing, spending money to research and develop an intangible asset. If this is the case, then we're going to have assets recorded at relatively low amounts since the costs are expensed. R&D is expensed. There are rare cases, short windows for very particular types of R&D, but for the most part, we just always expensed it. We only capitalize costs incurred following the development of this asset, like filing fees, legal costs in actually getting it. So this is after the R&D has been performed. We got a working model. And the rationale behind this, I won't go too far into it because we'll talk about it later, is we want to, it's just too uncertain to record an asset value to say, hey, this asset's going to have economic benefits when we're in the R&D stage. It's too uncertain, and we're going to have to take a wait and see approach until we actually have something useful. And that's why after the R&D has been performed, after we have something that's workable, we're filing patents, we're setting up our copyright or our intellectual property rights for this process, and hiring lawyers and such. That's the only time that we can actually add value to an intangible asset. Most of it is just flushed through the income statement as R&D expense, and we'll talk more about it later. So what are the types of intangibles? We have, marketing related intangibles. So trademarks, trade names to, market our stuff. That's certainly one big type. Customer related intangibles. So we got customer lists, we got production backlogs. Those are things that provide information to companies about, like, well, how much in demand are certain products, what markets do we have for these products that are available, and being able to channel into those markets efficiently. Artistic related intangibles, streaming rights, motion picture rights, copyrights to use any kind of literary work, painting, photo, film, right? You have to pay for the rights to sing songs in a movie, as long as the copyright is still in play. And this is just a sort of legalese thing. You don't have to worry about that so much now. Usually the useful life is much shorter than the copyright a legal life, 70 years after the death of the creator. Contract rights, contract related contractual agreements. Franchises are where the franchisor grants a franchisee certain rights, usually to use trademarks. So if you're franchising a McDonald's, don't do it. Horrible. But if you're buying into a franchise, opening up your own shop, you are a franchise, and that would be an intangible asset on your balance sheet because now you have the legal rights to use the trademark. Capitalize the initial contract and legal fees, but any periodic outlays of cash are expensed as incurred. I don't know what that customer related contracts, we already talked about that. And technology related contracts, technological advances, patents, licenses, software systems. And then there's some legal stuff about patents we'll talk about more later. GAAP does allow the capitalization of legal fees and other costs incurred in successfully defending a patent. If it is not successful, if you are found it to be infringing on a patent with your patent, not successful efforts are expensed, for example, or like legal fees or legal expenses. But if you win, then that adds to the economic benefit of your asset. It's become more robust. You've established yourself and the value of what you have as an asset. I do want to spend a little time with Goodwill because it is an exceedingly important asset that is reported by many, especially the larger companies that are publicly traded. And it's something that's so hard to get our minds around and to define with any sort of specific mentions of exactly what we're trying to encapsulate with a value. It's just generally the capability that a business has that it's going to create earnings over the return that's suggested by the fair market value of the company's assets, of the company's net assets. So we're talking about the FMV of net assets, which means all I'm doing to establish this is summing up the fair market value of all my assets and subtracting off the sum of the fair market value of all my liabilities. I'm just going down and saying, all right, I think this asset is worth this much, add this next asset, which is worth this much, subtract this liability that is worth this much. And notice we're talking about fair market value, not book value. So we're not using the balance sheet value. We're using what I actually think I can sell these things for, or I can settle my debt for, which might not necessarily be the balance sheet value. Remember, back in the balance sheet, assets are listed at all kinds of values. Not a whole lot of them are at fair market value. So when we're coming up with a basis to establish, well, what do we expect to get? What is the return we expect to get from all my assets less all my liabilities? Then we need to go beyond just what they're listed at on the balance sheet. We need to think, well, what is the true value of this if I were to sell it? So if companies are able to earn a return in excess of this, then, and most companies can, that any excess over that would be goodwill. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. I can't just add the value of the sell price value of one asset to the sell price value of the other asset, subtract off the settlement value of a liability, and expect to get the exact value, because maybe those two assets, their values just don't add together. Maybe they multiply together. They're non-linear, right? There's also, for example, on the balance sheet, if we're just talking about the fair market value of the assets on the balance sheet, the fair market value of the liabilities that are on the balance sheet, we don't have a lot of recorded important items like the morale of our employees, the skill of our management teams, the good reputation of the company, the credibility of the company's operations and its financial reporting. All of those things affect the value at which a stock will trade. Therefore, those are items that add value that would not be in this, right? So there's missing pieces as well. Goodwill is not associated with specific contractual rights of the company, cannot be separated from the company. So it's not just like, oh, let me sign over my goodwill to you, let me sell it separately, right? Therefore, because we can't separate it from a company, the only time it can be recorded is when the entire segment or business is valued through an acquisition. So only recorded after merger and acquisition, M&A accounting. You know, a company just can't say, well, we got $1 million group of employees and our reputation is worth at least $1 billion. They can't just say we have goodwill. We have to have some verifiable economic indicator of value. And the way that we get that then is by saying, basically I've gone through most of this text, is by looking at, well, what is the purchase price and what is the fair market value of net assets, i.e. all my assets summed up at their fair values, all of my liabilities summed up at their fair values. If I pay over that fair value, then I'm paying for the great management, the extremely skilled employees that are happy and productive, the reputation of the company itself. That's all those things that are not recorded in this calculation are being paid for here. So if we're paying over that value, that's goodwill. So that's how we get that verifiable indicator of values through this purchase price. When we record it, right, we would record this acquisition, and this is real basic. Like, you know, you don't cover M&A accounting in detail until advanced accounting, but basically we would debit all the assets at their fair market value because we're buying them at their fair market value. We record all the liabilities as a credit of the acquired liabilities at their fair market value. Of course, we pay cash, so we credit that. And then goodwill just becomes the plug to this equation, right? I get the fair market value of the net assets is split between debiting those assets and crediting those liabilities. I paid the cash, so that is a credit there. And then the result of that, the missing piece, is the goodwill, which plugs in right there as an asset. Okay. Goodwill, again, is a complicated intangible asset. And it's so complicated that it has its own specific set of rules when we think about how its value changes over time. But man, is it ever so important in our economy these days. For example, during the pandemic, a lot of companies had to write down the value of their goodwill because there was impairments to this overall ability to generate returns that are in excess of their fair market value of their net assets due to what was going on in the industry because of all of the economic strain. And similarly now, because of, still repercussions of that, there are still goodwill impairments that are occurring. So now we're hitting into means of acquisition, and we won't get too far into this.